Good evening, and welcome back to Shadowline News. I'm bringing you a critical analysis of the political response to the Albert Ojwang murder case, examining the troubling disconnect between politicians' current calls for justice and their recent rhetoric calling for social media to be tamed and online critics to be dealt with. The forensic confirmation that Albert Ojwang was tortured and murdered in police custody has created an uncomfortable moment of reckoning for Kenya's political class. While politicians across the spectrum have rushed to condemn his death and demand justice, their words ring hollow against the backdrop of their own recent rhetoric calling for the harsh treatment of online critics. This contradiction reveals a disturbing pattern of political opportunism that demands scrutiny. In the months leading up to Ojwang's death, a troubling consensus had emerged among Kenya's political elite that social media posed a threat requiring aggressive state intervention. Politicians who once championed free speech found themselves echoing government talking points about the need to bring order to online discourse. Most disturbing was the participation of opposition figures who had since aligned with the government, abandoning their traditional role as defenders of civil liberties to join this chorus of condemnation against social media personalities. The Ministry of Foreign and Diaspora Affairs claimed that the surge in social media misuse has been fueled by the 2024 Gen Z protests and warned of potential harm to Kenya's international image. It cited organized cyber attacks by influencers aimed at discrediting government initiatives, while trade union leader Francis Atwoli went further, declaring at a shop stewards meeting that social media users, "It is time you stopped propaganda. You must love your country. If you are not patriotic, even investors will exit. Otherwise, we will plunge into chaos." Perhaps most telling was Dagoretti North MP Beatrice Ilacha's prayer at the 2025 National Prayer Breakfast, where she asked God to intervene against social media itself. "Our youth are hopeless, and we pray that the spirit of social media running our country is dealt with. May we stand for what is best for our nation and future generations," Ilachi prayed, asking God to cast out the evil spirit behind the abuse of social media. Her prayer concluded with a legislative threat: "We want to confess, as legislators, that we must indeed address that sector. We shall have the courage to stand and believe in what is good for our country." This shift represented more than mere political opportunism. It signaled a fundamental realignment where former opposition voices created an atmosphere where aggressive state action against online critics was not just acceptable but necessary. The language they employed was telling. Politicians spoke of the need to address organized cyber attacks by influencers and warned that unpatriotic social media users would plunge the country into chaos. These were not abstract policy discussions but concrete calls for state intervention against individuals like Albert Ojwang. The government's commitment to take action against those misusing social media to defame public leaders and spread harmful content, as stated in their mandate for social media companies to establish physical offices in Kenya, reveals the mindset that led to Ojwang's arrest. When politicians and government officials frame social media criticism as organized attacks that threaten national stability, they create justification for the kind of aggressive police action that resulted in Ojwang's death. Here was a social media personality being dealt with exactly as politicians had been demanding. The arrest should have been celebrated by those who had called for such action, yet the forensic evidence now shows that this dealing with a social media critic resulted in systematic torture and murder. The defensive wounds on Ojwang's body, the injuries spread across his entire body, and the clear evidence of a prolonged struggle paint a horrific picture of what taming social media actually looks like in practice. The forensic pathologist's findings reveal that Ojwang fought for his life against his attackers, contradicting every aspect of the police narrative while simultaneously exposing the deadly consequences of political rhetoric calling for harsh treatment of online critics. Following the release of the damning autopsy results, the same politicians who had called for harsh treatment of social media personalities have suddenly discovered their voices as champions of justice. Their statements condemning Ojwang's murder and demanding accountability create a jarring disconnect with their previous positions. This sudden pivot raises fundamental questions about the sincerity of their current stance and whether these are genuine expressions of horror or calculated political positioning designed to distance themselves from the inevitable consequences of policies they once advocated. Perhaps most troubling is the position of opposition figures who had previously championed civil liberties but had recently joined calls for social media regulation. These politicians find themselves in an impossible position. They cannot credibly demand justice for Ojwang without acknowledging their own role in creating the political atmosphere that made his death possible. Their current calls for swift justice appear particularly hollow when viewed against their recent support for the very policies that led to Ojwang's arrest. They helped create the narrative that social media critics were threats requiring state intervention, then expressed shock when that intervention turned deadly. This reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how state power operates, or, more cynically, a willful blindness to the inevitable consequences of empowering security forces to target government critics. The specific language used by politicians in their calls for social media regulation takes on sinister new meaning in light of Ojwang's murder. When Atwally warned that unpatriotic social media users would plunge the country into chaos, when government officials spoke of organized cyber attacks by influencers aimed at discrediting government initiatives, and when Elachi prayed for God to cast out the evil spirit behind the abuse of social media while promising legislative action to address that sector, what exactly did they envision as the solution? The forensic evidence suggests that for some in the security apparatus, addressing these supposed threats meant torture and murder. Politicians who use such language cannot now claim ignorance about the potential consequences of their rhetoric. They created an atmosphere where aggressive state action against online critics was not just acceptable but expected, then act surprised when that action turned lethal. This represents either a stunning naivety about how state power operates or a calculated decision to empower security forces while maintaining plausible deniability about the consequences. The true test of these politicians' sincerity lies not in their current statements but in their future actions. Will they now advocate for the very civil liberties they recently sought to curtail? Will they defend the next social media critic who faces arrest? Or will their commitment to justice prove selective and temporary? More importantly, will they acknowledge their own role in creating the political atmosphere that made Ojwang's death possible? Without such acknowledgement, their calls for justice appear as nothing more than political theater designed to absolve themselves of responsibility. The public deserves to know whether their supposed champions of justice will stand by these principles when the next controversial social media post leads to another arrest. The Ojwang case represents a watershed moment for understanding the relationship between political rhetoric and state violence. When politicians call for harsh treatment of critics, they cannot distance themselves from the inevitable consequences when security forces take such calls to their logical conclusion. The forensic evidence of Ojwang's torture and murder should serve as a sobering reminder to all politicians about the real-world impact of their words. Rhetoric about taming critics and dealing with dissent is not abstract political positioning. It has concrete consequences for real people, as Albert Ojwang's family now knows all too well. The defensive wounds on his hands and back tell the story of a man who fought for his life against attackers empowered by political rhetoric that portrayed him as a threat requiring state intervention. The political class now faces a credibility crisis of their own making. Their previous calls for social media regulation and harsh treatment of online critics have been revealed as potentially deadly. Their current expressions of outrage appear calculated rather than genuine, designed more to protect their political positions than to seek genuine justice. This credibility crisis extends beyond individual politicians to the entire political system. If the same voices that called for aggressive action against social media critics are now leading calls for justice, what confidence can the public have in their sincerity or their commitment to preventing future tragedies? The political system's credibility depends on acknowledging this fundamental contradiction and taking concrete steps to ensure it never happens again. True justice in the Ojwang case requires more than prosecuting the individual officers who carried out the torture and murder. It demands accountability from the political figures whose rhetoric created the atmosphere where such actions became acceptable. Politicians who called for social media regulation and harsh treatment of online critics must be held accountable for their role in creating the conditions that led to Ojwang's death. Without such accountability, their current calls for justice ring hollow and their commitment to preventing future tragedies remains questionable. The public deserves leaders who will acknowledge their mistakes and take responsibility for the consequences of their rhetoric, not politicians who shift positions based on political convenience. The political response to Ojwang's murder reveals the bankruptcy of Kenya's political discourse on civil liberties. Politicians who recently advocated for harsh treatment of social media critics now claim to champion justice, but their words carry little weight given their previous positions. The forensic evidence of Ojwang's torture and murder should serve as a permanent reminder of where political rhetoric about taming critics ultimately leads. Until politicians acknowledge their own role in creating the atmosphere that made his death possible, their calls for swift justice will continue to ring hollow. These are convenient expressions of outrage from those who helped create the very conditions they now claim to oppose. The question facing Kenya's political class is not whether they can convincingly express outrage at Ojwang's murder, but whether they can credibly commit to the civil liberties they recently sought to curtail. Their answer will determine not just the credibility of their current stance, but the safety of future critics who dare to speak truth to power in Kenya's increasingly dangerous political landscape. Albert Ojwang's death must mark the end of political rhetoric that empowers state violence against critics, not just another moment of convenient outrage that fades when the next news cycle begins. From Shadowline News, this has been your analysis of the political hypocrisy surrounding the Albert Ojwang case. As we continue to follow this story and hold all parties accountable for their roles in this tragedy, we remain committed to exposing the contradictions and demanding genuine accountability from those in power. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.